What's up, beautiful people? Welcome back to The Order. The NDA for the closed alpha for Suicide Squad Kill the Justice League has been lifted, which means it's finally time for me to talk about my honest thoughts on the game. The closed alpha was fairly limited, as we were only able to play the tutorial as well as the first few missions within the story prior to the game's first boss fight, so there wasn't a whole lot to chew on, but just enough to give you a taste of what the game feels like, both in terms of the overall gameplay experience and the story. I want to start there because the story is the one element of Suicide Squad that I've seen the most consistent praise for in many of the first impression reviews that have dropped, and I want to echo some of those sentiments. The voice acting performances, motion capture work, and line-to-line dialogue are all pretty fantastic. I found myself cracking up within a minute or two of the opening scenes with the squad, and the banter between the team feels like something ripped right out of a comic. Rarely do I find comedic dialogue in video games to actually be funny, but Suicide Squad managed to get at least a couple laughs out of me in the first hour or so of the game, and that's honestly really impressive. Rocksteady crushed it with the writing and cinematics in the Arkham games, and even in this brief glimpse during the alpha, it feels like that's going to be a strength yet again in Suicide Squad. And having the likes of veteran superstar voice actors and DC stalwarts like Tara Strong, Deborah Wilson, Susan Eisenberg, and the late great Kevin Conroy leading the voice cast, the game truly feels like a big AAA DC Comics event. Speaking of which, if you're a DC nerd like me, this game is chock full of Easter eggs and love letters to deep, and I mean deep, corners of DC lore, as well as callbacks to the Arkham games. From story references to murals painted in various corners of Metropolis, if you're a fan of hunting for Easter eggs, you're going to have a field day with this game. That being said, while I do think the minute-to-minute execution of the cinematics do work, I have some concerns about the actual nature of the story and the direction they've decided to take. It's a bit of a bummer that our first real proper introduction to the Arkhamverse Justice League is of them being brainwashed in the antagonist of a Suicide Squad story. And while we didn't get to experience a boss fight in the alpha, by all accounts it appears as if your mission is going to be quite literally killing the Justice League. I'm going to keep an open mind about this because, granted, taking down the Justice League should they go rogue has been used as the basis for the formation of the Suicide Squad in other media. My concern is whether or not killing the Flash, Wonder Woman, or even Batman is something that will actually stick, or will there be some sort of multiversal time warping solution to reversing all of this? Again, this all remains to be seen whether or not it will actually, play out like this. I just hate that I feel like I'm approaching this story with more trepidation than genuine excitement. With that being said, let's talk about the game itself. The game looks pretty great, hitting roughly 60 frames per second consistently on PS5, and it's a huge step up performance-wise from both Gotham Knights and Marvel's Avengers. Now, yes, Suicide Squad is a third-person looter shooter. The closest comparison I can think of is something close to Sunset Overdrive. This is a third-person action game with a heavy emphasis on traversal and verticality more than on-the-ground gunplay and tactics. Each character's traversal works completely differently, some better than others. King Shark, for example, who was my main during the alpha, has a relatively simple and straightforward approach. He jumps really high and leaps really far, making him fairly easy to get a handle on. Captain Boomerang's Speed Force Gauntlet requires a bit more precision to aim and zip around the map, but his traversal feels so fun to use once you get the hang of it. Deadshot's jetpack feels like it'll be incredibly dangerous the deeper you get down his talent tree, with talents that give him more fuel and a longer timer. But then there's Harley, whose traversal leaves a lot to be desired. She basically operates like a significantly worse version of Insomniac's Spider-Man, using the bat drone and a grappling hook to swing across the battlefield. The problem is the swinging feels much slower and less precise than the other traversal methods, and the fact that it has limited charges means you're constantly having to flip, double jump, and scramble to a landing spot to queue up the next swing. There's potential for it to feel smoother the further you progress your character, and maybe with more time spent playing the game it irons itself out, but at least in this limited experience with the character, she just didn't work for me. Again, each character has an individual skill tree that's primarily dedicated to enhancing their traversal abilities, so it's hard to say whether some characters will fare better than others once you get closer to level cap and have maxed out your talents. The reason I'm harping on the traversal so much is that it's a huge part of the DNA of Suicide Squad's combat. Enemies move vertically up buildings and horizontally across them, and sometimes behind shields, so you're constantly on the move. Gunplay itself is fine, but it's all at the mercy of how you move across the battlefield, aiming and firing at enemies. Speaking of which, while there wasn't any aesthetic variety to the enemies, they all by and large looked like the same Brainiac skinned enemies you've seen in most of the gameplay videos. There is some cool diversity in how each of these units function. For example, some enemy units carry shields that can't be damaged by gunfire and have to be meleeed first before you can shoot them. Melee is a vital part of the combat loop in Suicide Squad as a secondary form of damage and as a means of finishing off certain enemies for shield harvesting. While there isn't any Arkham level complexity to it, it's pretty much just, mash the melee button, it does at least mix up the combat and there are some cool looking melee finishers. Another enemy unit worth mentioning called snipers have a fun mechanic where you can't approach them in close range or they'll teleport away, so you have to pick them off from afar while dodging or countering their attacks. While I'm hoping we see additional enemy factions or even just enemy units that look different during later portions of the game, at the very least Suicide Squad does a good job of keeping you on your toes by forcing you to constantly change up your approach depending on the enemy type. I mentioned countering, which is a small nod to the Batman games. When enemies display this indicator, it means you can hit them with the counter button, which is different from your firing input, and hit them with a counterattack, which makes them susceptible to shield harvesting and an instant kill. Again, another nice wrinkle that keeps combat engaging. Combat is built around a combo meter that builds up as you do damage and get kills, and the higher this number goes, the more skills and combo buffs from your talent tree it unlocks. The overall feel of the action is kinetic and frenetic, but maybe a bit too much on the side of frenetic. Oftentimes, there is way too much happening on the screen. Particle effects, explosions, damage indicators, UI shaking. There's a better than 50-50 chance of many people getting headaches playing this game because it is a serious sensory overload at times, and I sincerely hope this gets toned down over time. The talent trees are where you will most define your playstyle in Suicide Squad, and while there wasn't enough time to unlock everything obviously, I did get a chance to look at every skill present. I'll save the nitty-gritty for a later video, but there is a ton of potential for some really unique and fun builds in Suicide Squad, and a lot of thought was put into how this all functions. And yes, being that this is a looter shooter, how about that loot? I was really impressed by how impactful gear rarities truly felt, and it made hunting for new gear and getting new drops actually exciting. For example, the moment I got my first legendary weapon as King Shark, I was blown away by just how impactful it actually felt. It was a heavy weapon with a cool mechanic where after a certain number of critical hits, the gun automatically reloaded. The twist? The gun also had a huge buff to critical chance, meaning it was almost always doing critical damage and almost always reloading. What a fun weapon, and this was just a small taste of the unique weapons I was finding even in this early sample of the game. This is where I feel like Suicide Squad sets itself apart from a game like Marvel's Avengers, which has often been compared to, where I never felt a real incentive to chase after loot in that game. The gear here feels worth getting excited about and experimenting with, and that alone puts it in a much better place to succeed as a loot-driven RPG. Alright, so big picture, what are my genuine final thoughts on all this? I've long been cautiously optimistic about this game despite the heavy amount of pessimism surrounding it. Would I have wanted to see the rumored single-player Superman game from Rocksteady? Sure. No, seriously, that would have been, amazing. But this is the game we have, and I'm going to judge it for what it is and not what it could have been or should have been. I came away from the alpha with largely the same concerns and questions I had going in. Will there be enough enemy variety? Map diversity? Will the combat stay fresh long term? Will there be enough content updates to live up to the live part of the live service model? But I think there's enough here with the storytelling, loot and build possibilities, the frantic fun of combat, and the potential for some seriously great co-op action to get me in for launch and beyond. There are some issues that need to be worked out, namely the frenetic overload and some traversal quirks, but the alpha provided a decent taste of a game I'm eager to dive into further and give a fair shake to. Let me know in the comments below what topics you'd like to see covered more for Suicide Squad Kill the Justice League. Character builds, story breakdowns, whatever you're eager to hear more on. If you found this video helpful or insightful at all, be sure to hit it with a like and subscribe to the channel for more gaming coverage and insight. Until next time, have a good one.